Okay, this is our beautiful garden inspired bag here today, and we're making a medium makeup bag. And it's a larger size. It's about 7.5 inches long and about 5 inches wide, about 6.5 inches tall. So a nice big chunky bag. And this video is a tutorial. You can sew it along with me. So I put in the description all the sizes of everything and the fabric requirements, but I'll just tell you outright, it takes about 1/3 of a yard of the outside fabric, 1/3 of the yard of inside fabric, and a 9-inch zipper, a little quilt batting, and a piece of printer paper, and we are ready to go. So let's just jump right into making this. So we're going to need a piece of paper, like a printer paper. So mine is 8.5 by 11 inches, but you could also use an A4. That would be totally fine. So I'm just using a piece of paper, and I'm grabbing some fabric that I would like for the outside of the bag. So I'll put all of the dimensions in the description, but you need about 1/3 of a yard for the inside and 1/3 of a yard for the outside. You're also going to need some quilt batting and a 9-inch zipper. So, but those are just approximate. So if you were pulling things from your stash, that would probably be the best thing. So here I'm just using that piece of printer paper, and I just cut my fabric larger than that all around by like a 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch. And then I made one edge like super straight. So that way, when I start my quilting lines, I have like a straight edge to do that from. So I just cut out 2 layers of fabric, because what we're doing is we have one piece of printer paper, but we're going to make 2 sandwiches here. So 2 sections of that. So one is one side of the bag, the other one is the other side of the bag. So here I have my 2 pieces of fabric that are going to be the outside of the bag, and I can just layer them and cut them at the same time. So that's what I'm doing. And then I'm going to put that fabric on batting, and then I'm just going to cut the batting out. And also I've got that batting double layered, so I have 2 layers here. And my batting is really thin, which is nice to make bags with. So I'm going to just do this kind of in one motion, but just so that you know, I have 2 layers of batting here. So I'm just going to take it and lay it out, and then I just roughly cut this out with my scissors. And then any like scraps I have of batting, I usually save those, because I want to make I make this certain bag a lot. I call it in my mind like a hippie bag, but it's basically like a crossbody bag, and that's what I put like my iPad in or my phone, and that way if I'm doing chores, so I basically use this hippie bag thing every day. But what I use big straps on it, so that's why I save these little pieces of batting from all of my projects, so that I can put those in the straps of this bag that I make. But this one we're making is our medium makeup bag, so this doesn't have any straps or anything. I'm just kind of telling you for future projects here. So at this point, I've got the top layer, which is the outside of our bag, and then our batting, and then we'll be adding the fabric that's for the inside of the bag. We'll do the same thing. We're just cutting 2 pieces, and I think I'm doing the inside fabric. I might do that 2 layers at a time as well. So any of these little batting pieces, that's what I was talking about. I just like to save those for kind of future projects, but this size of scrap of batting is great for like straps of bags. So I just wanted to throw that out there. So here I'm going to now lay out double layers of the backing fabric, which will be the inside of the bag. And then we're going to take these 2 separate quilt sandwiches. We'll go ahead and quilt those. And then we're going to work on a pattern, and then we're going to trim it to the size of the pattern. So for choosing the inside fabric, obviously you could use the same as the outside fabric if you want to. That would be really pretty. In this case, I'm using, I would say, contrasting fabric. And if you wanted to do this bag with scraps, you could do, like a lot of times I'll do like either scraps for the outside or scraps for the inside. But you could actually do both. You could do like a scrappy version on the outside and the inside. And that would be great, because that would actually use up a lot of fabric, and that would be really pretty and really fun. But in this case, I have a lot of this pink fabric. I got this at Joann's, and you know, they were at the end when they were closing out, they had like minimum cuts that you had to get in fabric. So I ended up with a whole lot of this pink fabric, and I really like this for inside of bags. So that's what I've been using for the inside of a lot of the bags I've been making. So I just did a double layer and just kind of like roughly cut that out with scissors. And now I have enough for 2 different quilt sandwiches, one for one side of the bag and one for the other side of the bag. So if you look in the description, I'll give you the requirements. But basically what we need is for the outside, you're going to need 2 of these like printer paper size pieces, 2 4-inch squares, and 2 strips that are 2 inches by 14 inches. And then in the inside fabric, you're going to need like what we've just done here, so a little bit larger than that first printer paper cutout. And we do want the nice sides of both of these showing. But then you'll also need some 2-inch strips from the inside fabric, and then that's it. So pretty straightforward for making the pieces that you need to make this bag. And you'll see how each one of these is used as we move forward. So it can be a little confusing the first time you do it. So now this fabric is pretty wrinkled, so I do need to press this just so I don't accidentally quilt like wrinkles into the fabric. So I'm going to do that before we get started. And then we're also going to take that printer paper, and we're just going to turn this into our pattern. So we're going to do this, and then we're going to set this aside and then bring it back when we're done with our quilting. So I'm folding this in half lengthwise. So the long 11-inch side now becomes like 5.5 inches. So the long way, we're going to fold that in half. And then I'm going to take a ruler. And if like my fold is on the left side, on the right side, I'm going to just mark like 2 inches down from the top. Just put a little mark there. And my paper's not folded right, so I'm going to just quickly refold that a little bit. So I'm just going to mark the 2 inches down here. And we just want to draw here just like a nice gentle curve. Okay, so I just cut that. That shape was kind of pleasing to me, so I went ahead and cut it. If I didn't like it, I would just keep redrawing it until it was okay. But it's such a gentle curve. It's kind of an easy little sketch thing to do. So now I'm taking one of the quilting sandwiched pieces here, and I had made that top edge like really straight. And then I'm just going to use some washi tape, or if you have masking tape, any kind of tape would work as long as you think you can easily get it back off of your fabric. We don't want to gum it up too much, but any kind of tape would probably work. So here I'm just making, I'm just putting down this top layer of tape, and washi tape is nice because it sticks enough that it's fine, but it's kind of easy to reposition. So usually by the time I'm done doing one of these things, the washi tape, I throw it out because it's not sticky enough again. But so then I just use the edge of my foot against that washi tape. And that way, when I move it, I have like nice consistent quilting lines. So in this case, my lines are about 1.25 inches apart. And I feel like that works well with this fabric because it's a large print and I kind of want to see the design. So I thought I would do a little bit less quilting so you can kind of still see that design. So if I had quilted it super close together, you might start losing, you know, the big flowers or whatever. It might be harder to see them. So that's just kind of up to your eye, whatever looks good to you. But these lines are far enough apart that this whole process only took me about 2 minutes on one of these quilting sandwiches. So this went really fast. And I'm using like gray thread in the top and like a dusty pink in the bottom, just because when I quilt stuff, a lot of times I just want the actual thread color to just kind of melt into the piece instead of having it stand out. I mean, sometimes I will do that, but I do kind of like having it a little bit more like chameleon-like through these like let's say pretty like focal fabrics. I'd rather see the fabric than the thread. So I will use like a gray or Wedgwood blue or something that just kind of melts into the fabric. So now I have this one side done, and I'm going to go ahead and quilt the other sandwich. And as I said, this is one side of the bag and then the other side of the bag. So that's why we're doing kind of the same thing on both pieces. Okay, so now both of our quilt sandwiches are done, and I'm just going to trim them down to this template. And the reason why we made these sandwiches bigger is just that if there's distorting when we quilt, then, you know, we're kind of trimming that out. So if there was a lot heavier quilting, the piece might get a little bit distorted, or it might shrink a little bit. So that's why I just do a little extra. And then we can trim it down to the exact size, and it makes it a little bit easier to put the bag together. All the sides and everything matches up a little bit easier. So here I trimmed those top curvy edges, and now we're going to add our 2 binding strips, our 2" by 14" strips. We only have 2 of those, so 1 for each side of the bag. And I'm going to add the right side down on the inside part of the fabric. And now here, when I add it just along that curved edge, so now when I have the one side of it sewed, then I fold over about 1/4 inch and then fold it over again, and then we're going to sew that gentle curve around the top of this bag. So what we're doing is putting like a really nice professional looking binding strip on this. It covers up that raw edge, and it also gives us the ability to just easily add it to the zipper instead of doing a whole bunch of steps when we add the zipper. When you do it this way, you can just top stitch it right to that zipper. So I tend to use this way of doing it most times. So I did leave like long tails on both sides. That's why, you know, our bag is 11, or if yours might be a little bit, I guess it would be a little bit shorter if you have A4, but we're leaving like extra length on those edges. I should say on the end of these binding strips, just to make sure that we have enough to sew when we do the sides of the bag. So it's kind of intentional. We want to leave those tails on for the moment. And I'll be telling you exactly when to trim those off. So we just finish up this edge. And the next thing that we're going to do is work on the zipper. We're going to add some fabric tubes onto the end of the zipper. And I'll show you how to do that. But that will, again, give us like plenty of extra fabric on the sides of our bag. And it looks really professional and really nice. So here our 2 sides are finished. And now this is what this tube ends up looking like, and now I'll show you how to put that on. So this is our 9" zipper. I'm using a sport zipper, and you see it has a little overhang past where that zipper is. So you're going to take the good side, the right side up of this zipper, and you're going to put your 4" square face down, and I'm just putting it so that's like a 1/2 inch past the tab of the zipper. So now I'm turning that zipper upside down. And you can see now that nice side of the square is showing. So if you want to do it this way to start out, you can. And now we're going to just pull in one side and pull in the other side. You're not going to fold it like this. I was started to do this the wrong way. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to fold that nice side of the fabric back. And then we're just going to cover it with this other fabric. And that way when we pull the tube inside out, you're only seeing that nice seam on the outside. And this will be underneath, so you won't really see this at all, but we might as well make it as finished as we can on the inside of the bag. So here I can tell it's about a 1/2 inch away from my bottom tab of that zipper. So whatever length you have here, you just want to, you don't have to necessarily snug it up against that bottom tab, but as close as you can get. It looks the nicest, I would say. So here I'm just sewing this. And remember, we had started with it, the nice side of that square with the nice side of the zipper facing up. And so here we flip it over and we're back to that nice side of the zipper. And that way you just don't have any folds showing. So now we're going to add the part of the bag, the half of the bag, whatever one you choose, to our zipper. And I found the center of my zipper and the center of my piece. And for me, it didn't look right. So I adjusted it to where it looked right. And that's why we have these long kind of tube things on the end of our zipper. So however you lay this, it's going to work. So you do want to just have some of those like tubes on the end of this zipper just showing. If the zipper pull too close to the end, it might disappear at some point. So you just want to have some of those showing at the end. So I'm starting from the center of my zipper and I'm back tacking there, and then I'm sewing it to one edge, and then I'll go back and do the first half. I'm just doing that so that everything stays nice and where I want it. And as long as you sew like you end in the same spot you started in, then it's not noticeable at all. So you can totally, like when you're top stitching onto a zipper, as long as you're kind of ending where you start, then you won't notice that very much at all. So that's totally fine to do. And back tacking too. You just want to be back tacking like right in the same line of stitching, and then you won't notice that at all. So here I'm just stitching to the end of the actual quilted piece of the bag. And then what we end up with is a really nice looking side when this whole project is done. The side of your bag looks nice and professional. So here I'm adding that second side, and what I'm doing is lining up the sides of those quilted pieces and the bottom, just making sure that lines up, because then your zipper is already centered or however you wanted it. So once that lines up, you know that everything is perfect. So then you just add the second side, and now we want to have the bag, let's say inside out. So you're seeing the lining fabric, and you do want that zipper open. So now we're going to sew the bottom of the bag shut, and I'm using the inside strips, the 2-inch strips, for the bottom of this bag. So you're going to have one that's probably 14 inches long. So you just want some stuff hanging over each side. And we're going to sew the bottom of this bag shut with a 1/4 inch seam. And all these seams are 1/4 inch unless I'm telling you something different. But here we're going to sew 1/4 inch, and we're going to sew a binding strip on at the same time. So right now I'm sewing the bottom seam shut, and I have a binding strip on it as well. And then once we sew this whole bottom shut, we're going to just flip the bag around. So at this point, it doesn't matter which side you're starting on. They're both the same, so it doesn't matter. And then once we have this binding strip sewed on, you can just trim that flush so the ends of this are raw. So in binding strips, the very last thing you do, we're going to like finish those ends off, but everything else can just end. The ends can be raw. So here I'm just again folding in a 1/4, it's about 1/4 inch, and then folding that over, and then we sew along that fold. So what we're doing is we're hiding that first seam, and we're just finishing these seams off so that everything looks super nice and professional, and it just looks really pretty. And in this case, I'm using the binding strips that are pretty matchy-matchy here. But if you do want to use different binding strips, you could put scraps together and do this. You could do whatever you want, but it is kind of nice to have like a coordinating binding strip or contrasting or whatever you want to do. But like I said, in this case, I'm just using everything that perfectly matches. But you definitely don't have to do that. So I'm just going to sew along here, and we're going to close up the bottom of this bag. So with binding strips, you just want to keep it nice and loose and gentle. Like you don't want to be pulling it so that you have puckering going on. Okay, so once we pull this out, we're just going to trim those binding edges off, and then we're going to flatten this bag out. So at this point, we're going to be sewing those side seams, and the bag will still be inside out, and your zipper is still open. But we're going to flatten this bag out. And what we're going to have is that seam that we've just sewed, so the bottom of the bag. You're going to have that on one side, and you're going to have the zipper on the other side. So the zipper will be centered, and then when we flip that over, and we still have those long tails coming out of the side of the zipper, that's the way it should be. And then when you flip that over, you would have that center seam that we just sewed should be matching up with your zipper. So if it doesn't, you just want to adjust it. That way you'll know your bag will be nice and centered. And then here we're going to sew this side seam shut with these tails hanging out, and we're also at the same time going to be adding another binding strip to this. Okay, so I'm just sewing the seam, and when we get to all these tails hanging out, I'm just making sure that they're, you know, where they should be and that they're lying flat, and I'm just kind of slowly sewing through this. It's not bulky at all though, so it's not like you're fighting them or anything like that. You just want to make sure that they're all flat. And then we're going to sew this seam, and then we're going to quick turn this side inside out and just make sure that the seam looks really good before we trim off those tails. So once we're done sewing this, I'm going to just quickly turn the bag inside out and get a quick peek and make sure that everything looks good. And then I'll just turn it back inside out, and then we'll just finish sewing that. But I just want to make sure that nothing is tucked in there funny or anything like that. And I did not have any of those issues, so I do think this is pretty straightforward. It's not anything you need to battle with or anything. But I just want to check it before I cut these tails off and before I finish this seam off. And because if something's wrong, you can just easily seam rip it out and just re-sew it. No big deal. So now everything's good, and I'm going to keep that binding strip out of the way and then just cut these tails off. And this way I can bring that binding strip back around and sew the other side. And this area is not very bulky. I didn't really have any issues with bulk on this bag. On other smaller bags, sometimes they will have a lot of bulk, but this one seemed to be totally fine. So then I just bring this binding strip around, and that's why I love using these, because it's almost like magical how much it just finishes off those edges when you use these strips. So when I've sewed a little bit larger seam, the 3-inch seam, I have a little less binding strip to fold over and work with here, but it's totally fine. It will still work for you. And then I'm just clipping this all the way down, and I will just go ahead and sew this seam. And then we just repeat this process on the other side. And again, these binding strips are just raw on the edges. We don't need to have them finished yet. So, and it doesn't matter which side of the bag that you're sewing on. It's just, you know, you can sew it on whichever side, and then you just flip it over and finish that binding strip off on the other side. So each way will work. And you can see I've changed my thread color to pink. So now that I'm on the inside of the bag and everything is the same color, I'm just switching out my threads so that everything matches. Okay, so just a reminder, you definitely want to have your zipper open at this point, because otherwise you won't be able to turn your bag inside out. So we're just going to sew along this seam. And we just have a few seams left, and then our bag is done. But like I said, we're going to repeat this process on the other side of the bag as well. And then just want to encourage you to sew that first seam with your binding strip, and then just check it before you cut those tails off. But that way you know that it will look, you know, really nice on the other side as well. Okay, so one thing you want to think about when you're sewing these two seams, which basically sewing the bag flat, sewing these sides shut, is that in one direction we've had that center seam to deal with and we kind of had to push it one way or the other. You just want to make sure when you sew this second side that that seam is to the same side. Otherwise you're going to have a little twist in the bag and you don't want that to happen. So, and then the next step where we do box corners, we're going to have the same issue. So whatever side you kind of flip that seam to, you just want to make sure that it's the same on the other side. And so we're doing the same process here. We're just adding another binding strip when we sew this seam shut. And then we want to make sure those tails are all just sitting flat and then they're in the right spot. And then we'll check those by turning it inside out once we're done with the seam, and just do a quick check that everything is straight and nothing's gotten caught funny in the seam. And then we can trim those tails off and we'll bring that binding strip around and we'll be done with this side as well. These bags are so great to use fabric up in your stash, especially fabrics that are like focal fabrics or something that maybe you really loved but it's just not kind of working into other projects. It's kind of a really nice way to use that for a bag, and you could use that on the outside or the inside, because it would be really cute if like you pop them the inside and you can see just like a fabric that was one of your favorites, or you remember a special place where you bought it. It just gives you good memories. So it's kind of a nice way to use up your fabric by making these bags. And of course you can make these for gifts as well. So now I'm just, I checked that seam and I'm going to trim these tails off here, making sure that my binding strip's out of the way so I'm not cutting into that at all. And then we'll bring that binding strip around and just finish this edge off really nicely. So now this part of the bag is done, and what I've done is I've drawn out 1 3/4 squares on the 4 corners, and we're going to cut those boxes out. So it's like 1 3/4 square, and we're going to trim that out of each of our 4 corners here. And this is what is going to make the box shape of the bag. So the more accurate you are here, the more these box corners will match each other, which just helps the bag sit nice and flat. And the binding strips that we're using here also help this bag keep its shape, and it just helps it to have that really boxy shape, and you don't need to worry about it or be adjusting it or anything like that. Since we have these nice stiffer seams, it just really helps it to stay in place. So here we're going to kind of pop up those squares that we just cut, and at this point we're going to add binding strips, but now these edges we're going to finish off. So these binding strips need to have, I would say, at least 1 inch hanging over each side, and we're just going to make sure that those, like where we cut that square, that these edges match each other, because sometimes they want to kind of float away. See that, how it floated down a little bit? So I just want to make sure that those are really matching each other, and that our binding strip is also where it needs to be. And you can see this is a really small seam, but also here we're going to have to pick, like, see where that seam is. We're going to have to pick which side it flaps over to. And again, we just want to make sure that when we do the other side of that box corner, that the seam is flapping in the same direction. Otherwise, you just might have a little twist in your bag, and it just might annoy you a little bit. I don't think it would hurt anything, but if we're thinking about it, we might as well pay attention to it and try to get it pointing in the same direction. So here we're just going to sew this binding strip onto the bag at the same time we're doing this box corner seam. And again, it's a really short seam, so this isn't a big deal, but I usually do just slow down and just kind of, try to be careful, make sure everything's lining up as I'm sewing. And then when we're done sewing this, I'll show you how to turn in these corners, and that way you have the finished, not only a finished seam, but then the corners are also finished. And if you are a quilter, you recognize this, because this is how we finish the corners of a quilt. I'll say kind of. But it's kind of the same process here. So you just want to fold in that edge so that we just don't have a raw seam there. And I fold that over, and then I'm clipping this, and then I'm doing the bottom seam as well, because sometimes I will, sew it halfway and then work on the bottom seam, but usually it's easier to just do the whole thing and clip it than trying to finagle this while it's in the machine. So, and again, all we're doing is folding in that bottom edge, and it just gives us like a nice finished seam there. So it's not very complicated at all. It's just maybe the first couple times you do it, you kind of have to stop and think, okay, what am I doing here? But like I said, this is only a couple inch seam. So we do this on all 4 of our corners. And just to remind you, we do want to just make sure that that seam that we're pushing to one side, on the opposite side, that we're pushing it to the same side. So you'll understand when you're sewing it if that doesn't make sense now. And then at these 2 corners, I'm just going to back tack. So we haven't had to back tack hardly anything, because everything is going to, like, this seam will cross over almost everything we've already sewn. But here we want to, when we fold in those corners on our very last pass here, we just want to back tack. Make sure we secure those seams. Okay, so once you do those 4 corners, it does not take very long, and our bag is done. And we can turn it inside out, and you kind of see how those binding strips give you like almost like the stiffening of the bag, so that it really nicely keeps its shape. But I really do like these sides of this. So this bag ends up being 7.5 by 6 inches tall, so 7.5 inches long and 5 inches wide, and our bag is done. And I'm storing like extra makeup in here, and I love this little medium-sized bag. So my next project might be the large bag, so a large makeup bag. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I hope you're having a wonderful summer day.